Right, good afternoon. We are from the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Stirling. I'm a lecturer in digital media and professional work and learning, and Grant is a lecturer in dementia studies. So we're interested in how work is increasingly distributed across digital systems, in how responsibilities, activities, and decision-making in dementia care are being datafied and automated, a process that Gray describes as ways of seeing and engaging with the world by means of digital data. So if we consider the Fitbit, which has been a very popular object of interest in this conference. It logs a range of data about your activity, then working wirelessly. It downloads this data into your online profile, so you can, with a few swipes and taps, visually monitor your stats on a digital dashboard. So this is datafication that's actually enrolling a number of digital actors. So we have wireless networks, we have online profiles, we have screens, we have dashboards. So it's quantification of the self. But is it really just the self? So Lansing points to practices of covalence and surveillance, given the way that this sort of data is often shared with peers, and I think that came out in one of the presentations yesterday, and also that producers of these devices often track what these devices are recording. Or we might take the example of predictive analytics, of how clicks made by students in an online course, for example, turn into some kind of digital dashboards that are then meant to inform pedagogical strategies. I've been researching how these kinds of predictive learning analytics are changing teaching practices. But these kinds of analytics permeate most kinds of work at some level. And if you just think back to your last week of work and think about the number of digital dashboards that you yourself might have interacted with, these are examples of datafication. So care work with older workers is increasingly mediated by social robotics, by devices such as sensors, by the Internet of Things, by automation of practices such as medication management, and analysis of all kinds of data generated by people in care, carers, and by administrators. But the raw material for much of this is digital data. So that can be thought of as the things of professional practice that have been digitized or converted to binary numbers. That still doesn't really answer the question of what is data. It's not merely, or we're arguing, something that sort of shuttles from screen to screen. It doesn't merely represent real things, but in fact it helps to perform practices and bring them into being. As Gray reminds, data not only refers or designates, it can also stage, guide, and enact social life. So in that sense, data is political. It's often lively. And perhaps it's more helpful to think of data somehow as multiple or as data streams. Constantly interrelating with where it's been with where it's going. As I find in my own research, data becomes and does very different things as it becomes lashed together with sort of a different set of actors. So there is a sense here that data is not actually acting alone. It is acting with algorithms, with code, and an array of other actors. And this sort of data assemblage is also part of larger data ecosystems, which is a mix of actors, everything from technologies to digital service providers, policies, industry, public and private sort of sector entities. So when we speak about data, big or small, I think it's always that assemblage. And so for that reason, we think it's important to sort of unpick this sort of data assemblage to see exactly what it is that data is, what it's doing, and how. As Mike Savage points out, the enthusiasm for computerized analysis comes from the way that sort of complex phenomena such as care can be made simpler. Different things can be made visible, but this visibility brings new predicaments. Datafication turns previously invisible processes into data that can then be tracked, monitored, and optimized. So in some way, dark data, sometimes it's called even dusty data, and dark activities are now being made visible. But alongside these new visibilities are also invisibilities. The outsourcing to algorithms creates a significant shift in responsibility and control, and yet much of the powerful discourse that exists today encourages professionals to view digital technologies as a very natural part of their work. Moreover, we see the situation where work practices are increasingly relying on platform capitalism, the intersection of commercial technological infrastructures and the new currency of data. So players like Amazon, Google, Facebook are busy, enabling access at the same time that they're harvesting and monetizing data generated through everyday activities. And this kind of relationship with data is rife with asymmetries in terms of power, and it very much operates in gray areas of accountability and governance around data practices, all of which I think means we need to take a closer look at what we mean by data and what actually it is that data does, which then brings us to another question of how do you actually research data and algorithms? Something that is often sort of subsumed in the flow of daily practices, inscrutable and very fluid. And if you think about that, once sort of generated by a device, data then has to be transmitted, curated, labeled, stored, analyzed, interpreted, and at each one of these points, there are various kinds of data detours and translations, what Boucher calls algorithmic informations, and often these are very invisible. And here we're advocating or adopting ourselves as a more socio-material practice-based approach to look at how and why algorithms are incorporated and into specific practices and how these practices then change as a result. So opening up algorithms by studying algorithmic behavior. So that is just a big sort of an overview into a more critical look at datafication and data ecosystems from the perspective of work and workers. Grant's now going to offer some empirical examples of how carers and people with dementia interact with data and datafied systems. And then we're going to end with some consideration of some of the new data fluencies that we maybe need to be attending to, and different sets of accountabilities and ethics that are emerging if we consider things like data as perhaps one of our new digital co-workers.
Right, thanks for that, Terrie-Lynn. I hope you found that first part useful in introducing you to some of the major issues and concepts around data and datafication. Just to give a very brief introduction to myself, I'm a lecturer in dementia studies, and over the last few years, most of my research has focused on assistive technology and telecare, and specifically about how people with dementia and their carers make use of these technologies within their everyday lives and everyday practices, and what they actually need from the technologies in order to make the technology work for them as individuals. And one of the things that's come out from a lot of this work is that increasingly we're starting to see the potentialities of data and datafication approaches. And what I want to do for the next sort of 10 minutes or so is just to very quickly run through some of the major potentialities that are out there for datafication approaches, data analytics within the field of dementia care and the wider field of care for older people. There are a number of issues that emerge, which I'm going to explore with you briefly. So, in terms of the overall attention in the literature so far around big data and its potential role within dementia research and dementia care, we've seen three sort of major areas where attention's been given. So the first has been this idea of what potential and what role can big data play in things like health research and social care delivery for dementia. Potential examples include sharing of large international clinical databases and data sharing systems for biomedical research, and the potential that these hitherto unknown and unusable large amounts of data can play in actually progressing our knowledge of illnesses like dementia. What role does data and datafication actually play within current care technologies that are currently being used out there on the market or within health and social care services? So many of you here will be familiar with technologies such as Telecare. Typically, a telecare system will collect large amounts of data, particularly around activities monitoring, but there are questions about what actually happens to this data and what can we actually do with it beyond the ways in which it's being used at the moment. And then a third area focuses on issues around telehealth and biometrics and the large-scale collection of biological data around individuals and their health states at previously unimagined scales. Issues around telehealth and biometrics hasn't seen as much attention within dementia, where the focus has been much more around care and care practices. But I'm sure there will be potentials in this area as well. So I think one thing that is true is over the last decade or so, we've seen an explosion in the levels of technologies that are out there on the market, the levels of innovation around the field of elderly care and care of older people. But I'd also argue that when it comes to issues around mainstreaming many of these technologies and actually getting them out there onto the market or into clinical practice or social care practice, we've been arguably a lot slower. The main technologies that are out there in terms of telecare are the pretty much ubiquitous pendant alarms, which have been around for decades now, while there's a lot of talk around things like telecare and telecare services have also become quite ubiquitous. Things like smart home technologies haven't been grasped to the same extent, certainly at the level of actually delivering care in practice. I think there's a lot of pilot trials and research about how we could use these technologies, but actually getting them out there into the field, less so. But what I want to do now for the next few minutes is to run through 4 particular areas that we've identified that are potentialities for datafication, big data approaches, and also some of the ethical and moral conundrums that may well arise when we're carrying out, well, when we're using data in these areas. So the 4 areas I want to very quickly take you through are around the potential for big data in biomedical research, some of the work that's going on, and there's a lot of attention in terms of social robotics and a new word that I recently came across in preparing for this seminar, actually, around robotherapy. I'm not sure if that's positive or frightening, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Also around areas such as smart homes, the Internet of Things of Telecare, and how this feeds into ideas around delivering care remotely, and also ideas around the quantification of the self. And then lastly, and this is an area I've sort of been quite interested in recently, how can we actually repurpose existing technologies, and what existing technologies are out there that can be adapted or repurposed in order to provide care for people. And from my own research, this is something that hasn't received that much attention, but it's certainly something that's actually taking place in practice. People are out there doing this, relatively small scales, but people are out there buying bits of kit, whether it's CCTV cameras or whether it's things like Amazon's Alexa device, and using these, repurposing them in order to fulfill care activities. So I'll very briefly just explore some of those issues as well. So, first, in terms of biomedical research in dementia and this subject of big data, one of the benefits that could come from this is the ability of big data to leverage the collection, aggregation and analysis of huge data sets and huge data flows, amounts of data that hitherto we haven't been able to bring together, to aggregate, to actually analyse and discover new things about the experience of disease or symptoms connected to diseases. And to give you a very quick example of this, many of you may well be familiar with this. Back in 2016, it got quite a lot of media coverage. A game was released for smartphones, for Android and for Apple iPhones, called Sea Hero Quest. It was a sort of a 3D exploration game set on an ocean with you sailing around this ocean with various obstacles in order to collect coins and other sort of treasures. But one of the purposes of this game was to actually help us to understand changes that happen to visual spatial navigation in dementia. So the way the game operates was it generates, as people play the game, it generates a heat map of movement across these various environments, which then, when brought together en masse, can be used to give us an idea about how people are actually interacting and moving around these environments and how that might change. And this app, a few years ago, it generated a lot of attention very quickly, a lot of press coverage. Eventually, there were 3 million downloads of this app, which is the equivalent of 12,000 hours of lab-based research, of the same kind of research that people would previously have done, experiments with individuals brought into a lab. So we're seeing the potential here for a real upscaling of data collection that can be very useful for researchers, enable us to collect large amounts of data very quickly. But I'd also argue that there are a number of issues that arise in terms of how we actually engage with and use big data within this sort of area around conducting large-scale research. One question that does emerge is what kind of data do we actually get hold of when we're using big data? So there's a lot of attention around this idea that, well, big data, how clean the data is less important, because the fact that it's sort of capturing a corpus or a population, almost a census type level, it sort of smooths out the outliers, so you don't need to worry so much about things like sampling. And also questions about, well, what does this data actually tell us? Is this data inferring things like activity changes or behavioural characteristics across populations, rather than sort of issues of causation? And that's quite significant in terms of what questions we want to ask of this data and how we want to actually use this data. So is big data actually better suited at understanding how people with dementia engage with and adapt to the world en masse, as opposed to finding these more causative links? Some other questions: does big data give too much power to organisations holding and therefore defining what the data is and how the data is to be used? So here we have questions about, well, when we're collecting and using this big data, what priorities are we paying to the data and how are we planning to use it? Are we using data in ways that maximise efficiencies over, for example, patient care? And something that's quite close to my heart as well, predominantly I'm a qualitative researcher and I'm interested in narratives of experience. So do big data approaches ignore the power of the individual narrative of experience as a means of communicating illness experiences? And are there ways in which we can combine big data approaches while also maintaining these narratives of experience, which can be very powerful in communicating, for example, issues around dementia and its symptoms? A second area, and somebody showed a slide of this the other day, was Paro, the robotic harp seal that's been around for a long time now. I think it's been around for getting on for 10 years with various iterations. But what Paro points us towards is this idea of using robotics and social robots and care robots, and the sort of the potentialities that robotics may well give us for providing care in the future. And of course, many aspects of these kind of robotic care services or platforms that are being developed is the large amount of data that are required in order to make these platforms actually operate. So we see a lot of attention about how robotics could be used to benefit particular instrumental aspects of care. So we're talking about things like medications management or prompting. But we're also seeing a lot of attention around things like, can robots combat loneliness? Can they provide cognitive and emotional stimulation? And certainly from the point of view of Paro, there's quite a strong evidence base that it does benefit, it does bring benefits to people with dementia. It can reduce things like BPSD. For those not familiar with that term, it means biological and no, it doesn't. Sorry, behavioural, that's it. Behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia. It can reduce anxiety, it can improve quality of life. But there are questions about, does something like Paro bring any extra benefits compared to something like pet therapy or doll therapy, particularly when you consider the price of something like Paro. We're currently in a social care landscape in which I think it's fair to say that many social care providers and residential care providers are struggling, expecting them to spend, I think the price for one Paro robot is about £5,000, which for many care homes will be unachievable. So are we looking at the right thing? Are we overcomplicating things in terms of social robots? And other issues that emerge from robotherapy also include, how do we use robotherapy, and will it lead to reductions in contact with humans? So, for example, are we using robots to improve access to emotional care, give people more time to spend on the emotional aspects of care, or are we using these technologies as replacements? So I'll move on now, not only a few minutes left, but I'll move on now to Telecare. Many of you will be familiar with Telecare. Telecare services are largely ubiquitous within social care services now, and there are a number of future developments that we're seeing. At the moment, we're moving towards what I define as a mixed economy of telecare provision, in which telecare services are provided by social care, but are also at a small scale, but are increasingly being provided by private providers. We're also in the process of seeing a shift from hardware towards software. And within new software approaches to telecare, it's likely that data and algorithms are going to play a much greater role in the care assemblages that these technologies are positioned within. And through this shift, we're also seeing the growing potential for both large-scale data analytics and also for very detailed individual lifestyle monitoring. We've heard a lot about that kind of lifestyle monitoring that goes on already in the last couple of days, and this is an area that a lot of attention's being paid to in dementia. But then the question emerges, can we use this telecare-based data to actually, how do we bring it together and combine it in order to lead to further developments in care practice? This isn't an area that's seen a lot of attention, but I think there's a lot of potentialities around this data, but there are big questions about how we actually access it and bring it together and use it. And I'll just finish with my final sort of area in which I think there are potentials for big data and data analytics approaches, and this is around the dementia care and the health-related Internet of Things. And one area that I wanted to focus on here was the wide range of consumer technologies that are out there at the moment which can be used to fulfill care tasks. So I include a picture here of Amazon's Alexa, the Amazon Echo and the Alexa platform. And over the last year or so, since this was released, we're seeing, it's not really filtered through academically yet, but we're seeing a lot of grassroots organisations talking about how Alexa can be used to help look after people with dementia. So Alexa will never get angry or shout at you if you ask it what time it is 10 times a day. It can act as a prompt to support people with various activities, and a lot of attention is being given to this. But I think there are some important questions when we look at how we might use everyday technologies as part of care. Questions including, what about late adopters? A lot of attention gets paid on what we call early adopters, but older people are often later adopters of these technologies, so what actually needs to happen for them to be able to adopt these technologies themselves? What levels of data savviness are required and are necessary in order to make best use of these assemblages? What is the fit between these consumer-driven technologies which aren't designed for dementia and the needs of people with dementia? And then there are wider questions around privacy and data accountability. What happens to the data? How do companies use that data? Who owns it, particularly when these technologies are being used for care purposes? And finally, this does lead questions to if we're using these technologies within care, well, are we becoming over-dependent on the market in which technologies can be withdrawn, replaced and supplanted at any time? So we see examples like Google Glass, a lot of attention was paid. Oh, how can this improve healthcare practice? And then a lot of the research around it, well, a lot of the development was nixed. So I hope that's provided some interesting questions for you all to think about how we might use technology within dementia care and some of the potentialities. And I'll just pass you on now to Terrie-Lynn, who's just going to finish this section off for us.
Yeah, thanks. Those are good examples. So what we want to end up with is we're taking our lead from Jonathan Gray, who writes about studying data controversies in order to sort of theorize sort of the new vocabularies of data speak and repertoires of data work to ensure that different publics have the required literacies and capacities to align these processes with their interests. So really where we're going is to the area and interest around sort of data activism and sort of data from below. So we've identified two controversies and we'll sort of end with those. The one is around sort of data fluencies. So what are the new sorts of data vocabularies and repertoires that Gray refers to, and what are these new literacies and capacities? And we actually like the term fluencies because it gets beyond just that notion of digital skill. And then the second controversy that I wanted to highlight is the idea around accountability. So increasingly, one way or another, workers are dealing with increasing demands to be accountable for, with, through, as, and to data. And I think this raises questions about what does it mean to consider a professional as a responsible agent when capability is distributed across human and digital actors. We have issues around governance at another level around sort of data practices, and we just wanted to leave you with a few thought-provoking questions around data itself, sort of at the center of a storm around ownership, sovereignty, and stewardship. So what are the implications when we start to think about data not as something that a person owns but actually is? So Floridi writes that my in my information is not the same as my as in my car, but rather the same my as in my body or my feelings. It expresses a different sense of constitutive belonging, not of external ownership. And so where does that take us when we start to think around the difference between ownership and stewardship? Are the sort of processes that are currently in place actually adequate? And how can people be using digital technologies actually as a form of resistance against some forms of data collection and surveillance? And obfuscation would be one of those examples. And really, these are the kind of questions that we're interested in exploring. Would love to have your thoughts on how do this sort of extended organizational care network understand all these choices, decisions, responsibilities around digital actors and especially data. So we'll end on that note.
Okay, I think we've run over a little bit.
Oh, sorry
So
about that.
we may have time for a couple of questions if anyone has got any.
You said earlier that you were looking at the possibility of lower tech ways of monitoring individuals. I seem to remember about 10 years ago, IBM had a project looking at security systems, i.e. infrared sensors which are used as part of security systems in order to monitor people in their own homes. Obviously, this is a different use to what they had intended to be used for, i.e. security. But the idea was to monitor activity in the homes using these devices all over the home and build up a profile of someone's normal activity such that if the activity changed from what was predicted, it would raise an alarm. Has that been adopted at all or not?
Yes. I mean, that sort of technology is at the heart of the kind of telecare systems that are out there on the market that are being used, certainly being used by social care providers, by local authorities. And to be honest, the technology that's actually being used in practice hasn't really moved on from that. There's been talk around using things like GPS, and for about 10 years now we've been going through the same sort of ethical circles and discussions about whether or not it's ethical to use certain types of this technology. As I say, I think we're starting to see a shift among some of the sort of the telecare providers, companies like Thompson, etc., about moving towards software platforms instead of hardware. But yeah, in terms of what's actually out there and being mainstreamed within dementia care, certainly, and probably technology-enabled care, those kind of passive PIR type systems, we've not really moved beyond that at a large scale, if I'm brutally honest.
Oh, are there any more questions
If
while we are waiting?
while we wait.
That's fine, we'll wait for them.
Just on the technologies that are out there, I'm reasonably familiar with the technologies that are in existence in Scotland as part of the tech program there, because we've been involved in evaluation of them. And I think one of the issues is that there are a lot of technologies, and I'm about to talk about one actually, that we've done a specific evaluation of. But there is an issue with them reaching scale. There's an issue with implementation. So I think that it's not that new approaches are needed, but it's getting scale and getting wider adoption of them. And one of the things we've really puzzled is what are the barriers to implementation. And I think they're reasonably well understood. But is there anything that you think stands out as to why, given there is a need, these technologies have potential, but even when they're demonstrated to have an evidence base, they struggle to get beyond the pilot phase?
I think one of the problems is there are actually still questions about that evidence base. I know the evidence base for assistive technologies in telecare, not just in dementia, but actually the evidence base is wider than that, has been relatively patchy. And I think that sort of, for a long time, the limitation was this argument, well, there isn't a large-scale evidence for this. And then we had trials like the whole system demonstrator, which finished several years ago now, and there were a lot of controversies about the results of that. And I think that's often also being used now as a bit of a brake on mainstreaming as well. So the argument has gone from, well, you haven't got the evidence, there hasn't been the studies, to, well, the studies indicate there isn't an evidence base for this. And there is still a lot of public policy attention on rolling out telecare. I think Scotland, from our case, is a little bit more joined up than England is, not least because of the health and social care integration. But yeah, I think that there's still that sense of a lack of evidence as being one of the drivers for it. But as I said, there does seem to be a lot of attention on rolling it out at scale. But I think another issue actually is that when it comes to people actually adopting these technologies, that can be quite difficult as well. We often see quite a lot of abandonment of technologies. And I think there are questions which I'm hoping to explore in the future around how technology-enabled care is actually delivered, and if there are ways that we can find to personalise technology-enabled care to a much greater extent than it's being done at the moment.
Okay, well, we can talk about it again.
Yes.
I know we've got Malcolm Fisk at Montfort University.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to pick up where actually Grant and Terrie-Lynn left off. I mean, first of all, just to pick up on something that Terrie-Lynn said about data as new digital co-workers. Interesting thought. Discuss. And just there, Grant was making a point about the evidence base, and it's something I get a bit angry about, you know, talking about the whole system demonstrators and all the rest of it. I think some of the barriers are down to clinicians and others who clearly want a particular evidence base based on very large trials with controlled samples and all the rest of it. Grant's absolutely right. There were plenty of flaws in the whole systems demonstrator project, but there is actually a lot of evidence out there that is supportive of telehealth and telecare and what have you, which is very, very positive. The problem is it's based on small samples. So, you know, you find a study that maybe shows positive outcomes for 30 people in Kidderminster, and of course, the clinicians don't like that. That's not enough, sorry. But actually, 30 people in Kidderminster means 3,000 people in London, and so forth. And yet, these things are being overlooked. So there's an accumulation of evidence which is pretty damned positive, and which also very often reflects older people, well, all people, usage of different kinds of devices, and people actually wanting to sign into particular services. There is another barrier as well. Sorry, I'm going off text here, but there's another barrier as well because of the rather top-down approach that some service providers have kind of operated, because they're still living a little bit in the past from the 1950s, 60s and 70s, where it was a question of doing good for the old folk, as opposed to configuring the services and the technologies in ways that actually people want to use. And I think we're getting more private services developing now where they are offering different services where people are able to buy in and use different devices that suit them. And we've had some examples of that certainly today. And which I think will make a number of services wake up a bit more than they have done in the past. And Grant did make a point about that, actually, that there's more and more awareness of the fact that the technologies and the services are gathering, or can have the potential to gather more data, which is going to be very much more useful for them and the service providers, but also is going to be more usable for the users of those services in order to self-manage and a bit more and monitor their own particular health, well-being and lifestyles, more to the point. Anyway, my presentation, consumer perspectives and standards for telehealth services. So it kind of falls into two parts, the consumer bit, which I'll start off with, and standards is the second bit. But I hope you don't think this is going to be too arrogant, but I just wanted to just give you an idea of the sort of stuff that I'm working on. First of all, I do lead the Progressive project, which is a European Commission-funded project, which is focusing on standardisation around ICT and active and healthy ageing. And needless to say, that does bring within its remit some issues around telehealth and telecare services. But we do recognise that there's a huge number of domains that are covered by active and healthy ageing and by ICT, which I shall come on to in a moment. But out of this particular project, and I foolishly forgot to bring a whole stack of flyers with me. I've got about 10 here, which people can have if they want. But it sets out the fact that some of our main deliverables are to produce guidelines around smart homes, of course learning lessons from all kinds of initiatives that are in the health arena, but also in terms of energy management and things like this. But putting that in an age-friendly context, I think some of the people who are looking at smart homes are a bit too focused on the home as the place where independence is maintained without giving enough attention to the wider community and thinking about the same technologies hopefully being available to people in work, on the bus, in the high street, and so forth as well. So wanting to see, transportable, compatible technologies that people can take with them and use wherever they are, even though, of course, it will help positively in the home as well. And we're looking at co-production approaches as well, which is a particular challenge, and I'm pleased that co-production's been raised already today as well. And so we've been debating quite a lot of this within our project, and we have been putting together a ethical framework underpinning the project, which includes co-production clearly as one of those important things that needs to be in place. I should say, by the way, that with regard to the project, we have got a... Oh, have I got a slide on this? No, I haven't. There's a number of partners, including the Open University. It's led at DMU, but we have some other important partners, including Age Platform Europe, which gives us access to a very wide range of older people in different European countries, and also 4 of the European standards bodies as well. Okay, I also lead the Telehealth Quality Group, which is promoting standards in telehealth and certainly includes Telecare within its remit. And we're just setting up at the moment a special interest group which is looking at video and teleconsultations, which I think are going to be a very important part of both health and social care services for the future. And we're going to be looking at the protocols to support those kind of exchanges, that kind of contact. Yeah, let's have a look. Oh yeah, and just to pick up on the definition that we have through the Telehealth Quality Group of what telehealth is, and this is a very important definition, and it includes Telecare, don't forget. It says, the means by which technologies and related services, so it's not technology driven, we are people driven as well, that are concerned with health and well-being. So it's not just concerned with clinical health, it's concerned with how people feel and how they manage their own health, are accessed by people, not delivered to them, and are provided for them at a distance, irrespective of their location. And you can see that as a subset of e-health, but also embracing telemedicine as well, but always insisting on the health and well-being bit, just to get away from the dominance that might be the case if the reference point is purely clinicians. I'm also involved in a number of European standards bodies on behalf of ANEC, which is the European Consumer Voice on Standardisation, including Health Services Focus Group. You can see that there on the slide, patient involvement in person-centred care, and all the rest of it. And finally, I found my way onto this on the Mirror Committee for the BSI. There's a new ISO, International Standardisation Organisation on Ageing Societies. I'm not quite sure how robust or how important this committee is going to be. Its first meeting takes place next month. Watch this space. Okay, that's a bit of a background. First of all, on consumers, just to make the essential point that consumers come in all shapes and sizes and ages. This is consumer number 1, an elderly lady, quite clearly. Active and involved. Most people are active when they're older. They're not decrepit and dependent, far from it. A point that's been made earlier today, most definitely. Financially secure very often health literate, and very often decision makers. To reach an old age, you have to be pretty good at making decisions and having to deal with different circumstances that life throws at you. She's a survivor. She may be digitally literate. She may not have worked in an environment where computers and other devices were omnipresent, but clearly many older people are digitally literate. And she will want to be able to exercise her choices about the services and technologies that she uses. So that's consumer number 1. Consumer number 2, a young lad here, but you can see has got some problems already with perhaps diabetes, but certainly needs to control his blood sugar levels and so forth. Again, he's a future consumer. He's going to be active and involved. He will be learning about his health and no doubt be very knowledgeable in managing his health, a future decision maker. Definitely he's going to be digitally literate, and he definitely needs to be, because of the imperatives that we have around health, he definitely needs to be enabled to self-manage in relation to his health as far as is appropriate and possible. So his needs and choices are around the services and the technologies that he accesses. And so in fact the two of them clearly have very, very similar needs and similar outlooks and so forth. So first and most obvious point, patients equals consumers, equal people. They're part of the digital world in which we now live. People are, whether we like it or not, or whether they want to be or not, becoming increasingly digitally literate, but this, of course, brings with it the benefits of access to a range of different services and so forth, and familiarity with a range of different devices. And even if people aren't familiar with all those devices, there is an imperative here as well for the designers, of course, to make sure that the devices are accessible, usable, and so forth for people who may be challenged because of visual impairments, dexterity problems, and all the rest of it. So in that kind of context, of course, people's aspirations are changing, and their expectations are changing as well. So there, of course, there are challenges to old service frameworks, and the technologists must be aware and get their acts together about that. This just is to illustrate, if you like, the range of equipment which you've kind of seen some of with Terrie-Lynn and Grant's slides as well. Telecare in the mix, but as I indicated, video communications also very much part of the mix. And so we are, really, we are, whether the professionals like it or not, those boundaries between health and social care are just disappearing very rapidly and cast into doubt, if you like, the way that some people are defensive of their current territory. Telehealth domains, I just wanted to mention this in passing. They do cover a range of things, health and motivational coaching, very important as far as public health and preventative health is concerned. So behavioural lifestyle monitoring and so forth. Gait monitoring, we've had some of that today already. Vital signs, telecare and social alarms, M-health, mobile health, apps and all the mix, medication adherence and so forth. So lots of things in the mix which come, I think, within the arena of telehealth, and where more and more people will be using the technologies in new kinds of ways. And there's varying degrees of innovation around these and varying degrees and speeds of development in relation to services and the technologies. So the bottom line is telehealth, including telecare, is something for everyone, anywhere, anytime, people of all ages. It's not something which must be maintained as a ghetto for older people. And it's something as well for a range of different professionals who may have particular perspectives. They may be a bit defensive about their territories, but where clearly some of those boundaries need to be broken down, and people need to be able to appreciate the benefits of working in a more collaborative way, and indeed benefiting from the kind of data and information that is increasingly becoming available, and again, which was touched on very well by Terrie-Lynn and Grant. Right, I'm going to skip through a number of slides now, which I only included just in case a speaker didn't turn up, and I thought I might have more time to talk. But anyway, here we go. So bottom line, telehealth's a long way to go. Oh, and must be underpinned by the right ethics. I think Grant was going to touch on ethics, but perhaps didn't do as much as I was expecting. But if we cast our minds back to, if you like, healthcare, and it still gets trotted out, you get Beecham and Childress, right, and autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice as the kind of four key things to underpin some aspects of medical care. Okay, they are definitely in the mix, there's no doubt about it. Autonomy is something that clearly we would question, and I know that Grant would certainly question it in the context of people with dementia, and so there's an issue about the way that we provide services in people's best interests, and that we must be realistic about our expectations of people to self-care and self-manage and so forth. But there's a range of other things we have touched on, which I think are or will become ethical parameters around things like accessibility and usability, privacy by default has been mentioned as well, interoperability has been mentioned, and where I think there's an ethical imperative there as well, so that the benefits are going to be there for professional organisations most definitely, but also for people who are wanting to access services and have better choice and usability for the technologies that they may be able to buy or access in relation to their particular needs. And clearly the standards, this is my transitional bit, you see, brings me on to clearly the standards that underpin services and technologies and so forth must reflect those ethical foundations. And they must recognise, if you like, the new ways that technologies are being used by people, by consumers, by patients, and so forth. So that consumer perspective needs to be there. Right, what is the perspective for standards? This is a broad picture about standards for home healthcare. And apologies that you have to look sideways at this, but the chronology goes from left to right, more or less, from about 1998 through to to now, effectively. But the key point is that there's a kind of pepper potting of different standards or codes of practice that relate to telecare and telehealth services and home health services as well. And I think I've captured most of them in this particular diagram. And they relate to an interesting variety of countries, from New Zealand there to United States and, of course, the UK. And I just put a little plug in for the UK. You have got the Telecare Services Association, of course, and their code, which actually spans quite a lot of this period as well. But also you have the International Code of Practice for Telehealth Services, which I'm actively involved in. And you have the kind of replication of the TSA code in Spain and France and New Zealand. Very, very similar approaches. But they are, relatively speaking, top-down kinds of approaches. They're telling service providers, this is how you do it. And they are very much providing comfort zones for those service providers, and which aren't very permissive in relation to the new technologies that are emerging, especially the mobile technologies, or indeed any thought about video communications and so forth. So what we're seeing is that there is a trend. Maybe I'm slightly exaggerating by talking about a trend, but I do perceive the beginnings of a trend, perhaps, for greater recognition of the consumer perspective. Many of the codes are still rather formulaic. They like to have performance indicators that can be measured, which of course leads to all kinds of gaming, so that people tick the boxes in terms of what they do. The exceptions are the Telehealth Quality Group standard and a Canadian standard from Accreditation Canada, isn't it? Which both give guidelines rather than performance indicators and accommodate the use of a wider range of digital technologies. So I certainly think they're more user-friendly. But in the UK, watch out for what the NHS Shared Business Services say, and also what's happening in Scotland. Scotland Excel, I think in January, or at the end of this year, are going to be coming out with a new framework which will guide service providers, and they have got a new digital strategy out, which I haven't read yet, which only came out a few weeks ago, actually, which may give us some signals. And in the European context, there is the CEN TC 431, technical committee, which means there will be a European standards in draft at least by the end of this year. I'm on that committee through my ANIC capacity. The TSA are on that committee as well. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of that. My fear is it will be a little bit still too top down. Watch this space. Right, International Code of Practice, a bit of a plug for this. Now in its 2018-2019 version, I've kind of mentioned a range of different domains which are listed here, but down the bottom you can note there's a few extra things that are important here. The first is that it does incorporate the ISO TS 13131, so that very firmly fixes it in the arena of telehealth. 13131, by the way, is still again rather top down, but it's much better than some of the other standards I've seen that are dominated by clinical agendas. It does link in and accommodates alarm systems, social alarms as well. And it's obviously supported by the Telehealth Quality Group members as well, of which there are 16 at the moment. And just to give you an idea of what's in there, I mentioned that performance indicators, and within the international code there isn't a requirement performance indicators, but there is a requirement for performance to be measured, but the choice lies with the service as to how to do that, and this particular clause within the code gives services an idea as to how they might do that. Operational measures might usefully include time taken, number or frequency with regard to the following, but this is accompanied by a requirement that this information must be public, so that the person who's wanting to link into a particular service can make their own choices about what they, which service they want to buy into or which service they want to use. And you'll see there are a few things here which I've highlighted in red. One is relating to cybersecurity, which I think is crucially important. There was a point made earlier today about legacy equipment. I think it was Grant making it. And what do we do with all that stuff that's out there, especially when some of it may be vulnerable to cyber attacks. There's some investment issues here which I know they're looking at in Scotland, bearing in mind they want to go digital fairly quickly, but clearly there's a cost implication involved there. Having said that, you know, the Scandinavian countries have gone down that route, so why the hell shouldn't we in the UK? Right, and then yes, and I've mentioned the point about it being desirable that services are open with regard to those measures. And the other one I've just highlighted here is that services shall have policies for teleconsultations with users and carers via telephone, video links, Skype, VC, and so on. And this is a précis, by the way, but it does show that there's a number of things which do need to be in place about not just record keeping, but the way in which that contact takes place, what measures need to be in place for the reliability of the technologies, and so forth. And what happens, for instance, if you have someone with a mental health condition who has some kind of psychotic episode at the other end of the line. All these kind of things need to be in the mix. And by the way, there's quite a lot of development around telepsychiatry services at the moment, which is both encouraging in one sense that people can get more access to mental health services more quickly, but also quite worrying on the other, quite worrying if there are some cowboys in the mix there who perhaps don't necessarily have the right kind of protocols or what's the right word? Safeguards in place in relation to such services. So, summing up, consumer perspective, very important, the people perspective. Linking with that is ethics and a broader framework, if you like, of ethics that should underpin our thinking here. Certainly, part of the agenda is being driven by those new technologies which aren't going to go away. So, of course, we must take them into account, especially if people are going to adopt them and use them because they work better for them. So they must be considered, and demand will be influenced by that, and will definitely have a radical impact, I think, on the nature of telehealth and telecare services. Standards and codes of practice are beginning to change, I think, and so I think there will be greater flexibility and ultimately, hopefully, more consumer choice there. And yes, and new services are emerging. Old services will need to change. Be ready. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. Questions?
Thank you. Yeah. Questions?
Easy ones?
Shall I shout?
Yeah, I can hear that.
Good. This standard on ageing that's being developed, what's it all about, or is that the wrong question?
Well, let me have a look. What did I say? There are one or two things that may be on the agenda for the ISO. We're talking about the ISO standard for aging societies. Where did I put this? Oh, it's towards the beginning, isn't it? Oh, there we go. Yeah. What worries me at the moment is that it just appears to almost be a random collection of things that they've picked on. Now, don't get me wrong, these are important things, but I don't think there's kind of been a strategic view yet. The meeting in June will bring together people from right across the globe. So people from Peru and Japan and Canada and what have you will be there in the mix. And I think the BSI perspective at the moment is just to gather views from those different standards bodies before moving forward in relation to this particular agenda. But when they were looking to set this up and get the support of ISO, accessibility, social connectedness, chronic disease prevention and dementia-friendly communities were on that list. As I say, these are important issues. My fear, I suppose it's a fear. My fear is that BSI aren't being assertive enough on this, because if you look at APEC, that's Asia-Pacific countries, they are being very, very bullish about the silver economy and what this means in terms of how standards need to develop, including, if you like, the need to take account of the needs of older people almost in every standard. And it's this kind of broader message that, older people are part of our society. It's the issue is definitely around accessibility and usability, but not to treat people as some kind of, strange segment of our society, but as integral members for whom the inclusiveness and everything else and interoperability, all these kind of things need to be in the mix. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but can I just mention one other thing about the silver economy, because the word was mentioned earlier today. One of my fears about the silver economy is sometimes you read stuff which suggests that the manufacturers and innovators think of older people as a market to be exploited. Whereas I keep pushing, and the standards need to keep pushing the fact, no, because older people are potential entrepreneurs, as say, contributors, workers. Okay, there's a minority of people who are dependent and need support and all the rest of it. But really, all of industry, at whom a lot of the standards are aimed to improve productivity and commercial activity and stuff like that. But all of them need to get into a changed mindset, isn't it? So where older people are recognised as contributors to our society, as opposed to dependents who will buy into your services or buy your equipment. Watch this space on that committee. I'm hoping it is going to strike above my expectations, my initial expectations anyway. Okay?
One thing that's not on your standards is really protecting old people from being exploited. Another thing is looking at the ethics of data sharing, data management. In particular, there's going to be an increase in probably the number of times they go and use social services, a variety of other things like GP practices and so on. And in a world where this sort of information is marketable, it's quite easy to identify people who are more likely to be at risk of being exploited in the future. So the question is all around about ethics of data management, data sharing. Now, there are quite a lot of interesting developments happening in this country and in Europe regarding data management and sharing, which will change fundamentally the way we look at data. And that's going to happen at the end of this month. So I think not including that is a bit of a...
Oh, well, it's not included, Duncan, genuinely. I mean, we got this framework. I mean, I wasn't presenting on this, but certainly security of personal data is certainly in the mix. And actually, in the International Code of Practice, there's the question of the ownership of personal information is dealt with as well. So the fundamental assumption, I'm not sure if this is in the GDPR mind, is that personal data is owned by the individual, and that we entrust it, if you like, to those who are providing services for us. And with that entrustment, then clearly comes all kinds of obligations on the service provider to treat that data properly and only to share it with the appropriate consents and protocols and things in place. Having said that, now then, with regard to artificial intelligence, machine learning, stuff like that, then we get into some really tricky areas, don't we? Because, well, first of all, there's the issue about informed consent for someone who may have dementia. Also, there's issues about informed consent for data being treated or manipulated or used in ways which very few people can understand, especially, as I say, when there's machine learning in the mix as well. So trust comes back into the equation in a very, very positive kind of way. So security, yes. Trust, yes. Recognition of the importance of personal data and the privacy and confidentiality that attaches to that data, and also linked with that, if you like, audit trails as well. So if someone is scraping your personal data, then you can certainly follow that audit trail to find out who the hell it was and sue them. Sure. Okay.
There's more to it than that.
There is more to it than that, but that's my very simplistic consumer response. You can tell me more after. Okay. And I think I'm handing over to Eilis, is it? Oh. Someone desperate to ask a question.
I just wanted to build on that because there is the notion also, or the changing notion, and I'm not sure how that's coming out with what's happening at the end of the month, but around data rights. And you know, there is some work that's being done on this and sort of the ethics of technology around people having the right to see how they're being categorized by data and sort of certain data practices, and also to be able to challenge and change that.
Yes, this is data profiling, I think. Is that what we're talking here? Yeah, well, that's within the GDPR, isn't it? You have to consent to profiling, I think, in some kind of way. But the question is, again, you know...
But how is that actually going to play out? And especially when, you know, sometimes people sign informed consent to the first collector of the data, but then that data then gets passed on, and so then that audit trail becomes slippery. And I think you look at how the sort of average person is going to have the will or the capability to follow that up. So, I mean, I think it's a huge thing.
It is. It's a question that I'm not even going to start to attempt to answer, but it's a huge question, you're right, which we have to grapple with. One of the aspects of this, to me at least, is because, you know, the way that we go online to use different services, it says, do you accept the terms and conditions? Tick. You haven't got time to mess about with it, so you don't know really what you're signing into. And besides which, there may be 48 pages of information there about what you're consenting to, and then you might have signed away your right to any changes in the terms and conditions anyway. I don't know. Some very, very dodgy areas. There has been some initiatives, I believe, within the European Union to look at some kind of standard clauses that would give extra protection to consumers, but they haven't come to fruition as yet. And of course, in the UK, there's a big question mark as to whether or not they might be brought into the UK anyway. But certainly those kind of safeguards need to be in place, and protections need to be in place. But it comes back again to the word trust, doesn't it? But the trouble is there's so many big companies out there you know, your Googles and your Amazons of this world, and you wonder whether they play the same, to the same extent, according to the ethical rules that some other companies do. Okay, I'm going.
Okay, we have Eilis.
Eilis, it's
Lawlor.
fine. I'll answer to anything. So I'm here to talk about a piece of technology-enabled care, I guess, that we've been evaluating for the past 2 years. We're a research company and we specialise in a range of different kinds of research methodologies, including economic analyses and methods such as social return on investment. One of our focus areas is the social impact of technology. And we have recently conducted an evaluation of clever Cogs. It's very hard not to say clever clogs, along with this wider evaluation of the tech programme that I just mentioned. And some of our other clients in this area have included Government Digital Service, BT, Microsoft, Good Things Foundation. So we've a track record in these kinds of evaluations. So just a bit about the device. So it's a software system that's been developed by a housing association called Blackwood Homes and Care. And it aims to increase digital participation of homebound adults in receipt of care and support packages, improve the quality of life of older and disabled people. There are some enhanced Telecare features such as home automation, and the intention is that these would enable people to live independently and healthily for longer. And then to increase the use of technology-enabled care in the delivery of Blackwood services. They're also, they've made a capital investment in this technology, and the intention is that there would be business outcomes for the housing association as well. So it was piloted over 2 years with 147 customers of the housing association across several sites in Scotland. And just to try and describe it a bit more, so there's 3 key features. The main kind of piece that we ended up evaluating was this accessible way of getting online. So Blackwood's customers have physical disabilities and learning disabilities, and tend to be older people, although they have some younger customers also. And there are very high levels of digital exclusion amongst their customers. So, like the main piece that we ended up evaluating was this accessible gateway to the internet. And so it's a tablet device which has preloaded apps for things like online entertainment, health information, social media, and friends and family. And they're loaded in a way that's personalised to the customer's needs. And it has various different ways of using the touch screen, a stylus pen, and so on, to overcome any physical mobility problems that people might have. There's also a safeguarding inbuilt into the technology because the apps are preloaded, so people can't do general internet searches and so on. So it has to be agreed in advance the kinds of interests that they have, and then the appropriate apps are loaded onto their system. The Telecare features are things like automated medication prompts, handover notes, and so on. And then there are some advanced, the potential of it is much greater than the pieces that have been used to date. So the advanced options, things like video conferencing, home and mobile health monitoring, integrated alarms, and so on. These are still very much in development and haven't been brought online yet, but it has the potential to integrate all of those as part of the one system. So it was a 2-year study commissioned by the Carnegie Trust on behalf of the Scottish Government. The aim was to measure the effectiveness in terms of reducing digital exclusion and improving the quality of life of customers. And we also looked at the business outcomes, but I'm mainly going to talk about the impact on customers here today. It was a mixed method study, and we based it loosely on the social return on investment approach. But because of the limitations of the study, we weren't able to follow it to the letter, so we're not describing it as such, but it is based on some of the principles. So we began with some qualitative research and theory of change development. We did a survey at 2 points in time of customers, a baseline and a follow-up survey, a minimum of 3 months after the device had been installed. We did a time and motion study of staff, which had mixed results, and I won't talk about that much today, but it wasn't a major part of the analysis in any way.
And we've done an economic analysis, and I can't share the results of that with you yet because they're still being finalised. We had some surprising findings with that, and we've had to go back and revisit it. So I can't share those results yet. But that is an important part of it, that it is also cost effective. There's a lot of ways of getting online, even for people who are very digitally excluded. So I think cost effectiveness is also important. There were 4 phases to it. We began with the qualitative phase and developing the theory of change. Then we did the baseline data collection. We had a further qualitative phase where we followed up with some of the same customers. And then we had a follow-up quantitative phase. In terms of our sample, we engaged about 40 people as part of the qualitative research. About 19 customers, 4 of whom didn't have the device and 17 did. And then our quantitative survey, we had 93 baseline surveys, but only ended up with 56 usable surveys at follow-up. So we had quite a high dropout. Only a small amount of that was people who no longer wanted to or were able to participate in the research. Most of the dropout came from people either not using the device when it was installed or not having it installed after having the baseline survey. So this was quite an important issue for the research. It affected our results, obviously, and the power of the analysis. But there was also an interesting finding there about why there was such a high dropout, and I think that's important as well for the cost effectiveness piece, because it's not a particularly cheap piece of technology to have installed. So this is something that I'll discuss again a bit later as part of the findings. So this is the theory of change for the device, and so we've got these 2 main features, the internet access and the technology-enabled care piece. And the short-term outcomes, increased digital participation, increased time spent on meaningful activities, increased self-management of health, improved well-being, reduced social isolation, and improved independence. So these are outcomes for customers, leading in the longer term to improved health and improved ability to live independently for longer. So the pink outcomes are the ones for customers. For Blackwood themselves, there's also, it's intended that there will be efficiency savings and improved quality of care and support that they provide, so that if people are spending, if staff are spending less time on routine tasks, they have more time to spend caring for the customer or in social activities and so on. And it's also intended that over time that there would be some business outcomes around an increase in the number of billable hours and so on. For the Scottish Government, at scale, there would be improved digital participation of a very digitally excluded group, and then a contribution towards several of the national health and wellbeing outcomes. In terms of the evaluation, we really were just looking at the short-term outcomes. We didn't get anywhere near the longer-term outcomes, and even with that, we couldn't actually look at all of them because the pace of implementation we felt was slow. And many of the apps didn't come on stream in the life of the evaluation. Now, there were several reasons for that. Some were to do with the customers not wanting them, but also although we did find that this was an effective way of getting people online, it's a slow process, and that the approach is to start with things like entertainment and then work towards things like health information and health management and so on. But people were starting with, absolutely no digital skills. And so the process of getting them, although this does bypass the need for skills because it brings you kind of directly to the internet without having to find out how to get there and directly to the kind of information you're looking for. Nonetheless, it was still a process of bringing people along. And I think motivation was a really important part of that. And we'll come back to that again. So our qualitative findings for staff, there was they strongly felt it had an impact on efficiency and time savings, and that there was an improvement in their job satisfaction because they spent less time doing paperwork and so on. Customers also reported very high levels of satisfaction with the system, and several positive outcomes around how they were using their time, their digital skills and the confidence that they were getting from that, and then just general impacts on their well-being. But there was a very high degree of social isolation amongst the sample. Many of the people that we spoke to didn't ever leave the house much and didn't see anyone outside of their carers. And we also found that very few of them were using the Friends and Family app. And so when we did the analysis, only people who were using Friends and Family, which is the video calling aspect of the device, only those were asked follow-up questions about social isolation. But it was such a small group that actually ended up using that app that we didn't have very much data on that in the end. But actually, I think one of the issues was that the Friends and Family app isn't by any means a panacea. People also need somebody to call. And I think that was one of the issues, is that there were issues around loneliness and so on, and a lack of social networks. And one of the things that we found in our other research around social isolation is that people who have good offline relationships also have good online relationships. And so just having a means to connect with people isn't enough. And I think there's probably greater potential for people who are experiencing social isolation around the social media and social networking sites to improve their outcomes in this area. But again, it's a bit complicated because there's a very high proportion of the customers had learning disabilities, and there were safeguarding issues around that as well. So I think this was definitely something that the device was intending to tackle, but I don't think that we have enough evidence yet whether or not it can have an impact. And for family members, we only spoke with a small number of family members, but there were indications of peace of mind and improved potential for communication, and the safety of the customers as well was something that was important to them. In terms of the quantitative findings, so there were certainly improved digital skills. There was significant difference in the number of internet users between baseline and follow-up, and the number of customers who self-reported that they had good or adequate digital skills. A high proportion were going online at least daily. And many were doing passive activities like entertainment and so on, but a lot were using online gaming and things like that, so more sort of active online activities as well. We saw an improvement in life satisfaction that was statistically significant as well. It rose from 6.7, which is quite low, to 7.6 on average, which is on a par with the Scottish population. And there was also an indication that we had smaller sample sizes for things like boredom and anxiety, because not everyone answered all of the questions. So we didn't necessarily do statistical tests on all of them because our sample size has been whittled away. But there was an indication that there were also improvements in boredom and anxiety. Some evidence of better self-management of health. Quite a few people were using it for health information. And some evidence of improved independence amongst the sample as well. So broadly, it was consistent with what we found with the qualitative research, and there weren't any major surprises in the quantitative findings. As I said, with social isolation, we didn't have any evidence of that really, because we had such a small take-up of Friends and Family. But for those that were using it, it was having a positive impact. It was just quite a small sample. We asked about negative impacts. Customers didn't tend to report any, although some technical issues in the early stages, as to be expected. And the average satisfaction with it was 3.5 out of 5, sorry. We had mixed findings for our time and motion study. There was factors that kind of complicated the way it was carried out in the end. And we found out afterwards that staff were using dual systems and things like that really complicated the results, and so we weren't really very happy with the overall study. But we did find a reduction in time spent on routine tasks, but I think it was in such an early stage of implementation and staff weren't sufficiently up to speed with it that I think that they would need to do this again when I think some of the sort of problems in the early stages had been ironed out. We were also interested in implementation. We felt that it was, 150 customers over 2 years was quite slow. And so we did a survey of staff at the end to ask about some of the barriers to implementation. And we know that there can be substantial barriers to technology implementation generally, and that in an area like this, it's complex and dynamic and influenced by so many factors: staff, customers. Everyone needs to be getting on board and doing what they're meant to be doing, so it's quite difficult to implement. The results from the survey were that they were quite happy with the pace and standard of implementation, but they would have spent more time mapping the links to the wider systems and current ways of working, testing solutions, involving frontline staff in rollout and upskilling staff. And they felt that the key enabler was the personalised approach, and this has been mentioned before how important this is, but they felt that they were really taking the time to match this to people's needs. Now, the results at the dropout rate would suggest that there's more to be done on that. And that although that this was really central to what they were doing, that it wasn't as successful potentially as they might have hoped. So they were running informal and formal training sessions, familiarisation sessions. I think that's all great, but something seems to have been missing in that regard because of this dropout rate. So our recommendations, first on the dropout, one potential explanation is motivation. So there tend to be three things that people require to go online to overcome digital exclusion. They need devices, they need skills, and they need motivation. And Clever Cogs does the first two. It can't motivate them, but the training and the support around that needs to be there, I think. And we haven't done any research as to why this group didn't actually use the system or didn't have it installed, but I expect that motivation had a part to play. There was a very high concentration of cognitive impairments amongst the group that didn't use it. However, the study also shows a high degree of success amongst people with cognitive impairments in using and going online and using it really successfully. So that in and of itself can't be the only barrier, but it may be that it played some role, and that more support is needed. And we don't know what kinds of disabilities people had, so it may have been that certain kinds of disabilities were having an impact. Or there was insufficient research, as I was saying, to match the device to their needs. Staff and specialist skills. So, we observed, this is, the pressures on care homes was mentioned before, but I think, the experience of trying to do an evaluation in a context like this is that people are firefighting all the time and trying to get them to prioritise first of all, the technology, and then second of all, the evaluation is so way down their list. It was quite frustrating at times. And I think that the level, the specialist dedicated skills and staff time is really crucial to that. Now, that's pie in the sky, really, in reality, but it is a factor in implementation for sure. We also recommended for the rollout of the device that they adopt a formal implementation framework, that might improve the take-up and just improve the speed and success of the implementation. Most of the benefits accrue to the older age groups that were digitally excluded in the first place. So for younger people who were, tended to have their own devices and were often online, we didn't see any improvements much. And there were still high needs around well-being and social isolation and so on. So I think there may be other solutions required for younger age groups. And there's a question mark as to whether or not an expensive device like this is really cost effective when people are already digitally included. And I know that there are other reasons why they want to use the technology in terms of the business and so on, but from the customer's perspective, the benefits are quite limited. And so there's clearly a need for further research, follow-up studies, longitudinal studies to see, especially once the other apps are enabled. I think one of the things that we also observed in the communal, in the care home, in the residential care homes, because the device, some of the customers were in community settings, in sheltered housing and in residential care, and in the care homes there were communal devices in the foyers, and people were using them and gaming and competing with each other, and it was a really nice example of social interaction. We didn't end up getting to do any evaluation of that because the devices were already installed there before our evaluation started. But I felt like that was, had a lot of potential for future evaluation if they were rolling it out to other care homes. And then there's obviously research around the dropout rate, and to improve the range of social activities. Even though people, there was a small decrease in most people that we were involved in the research spent most of their time watching television. And there was an increase in the number of social activities that people were doing, but they were still spending a huge amount of time watching television. And we weren't sure if that was because they still had the television on in the background while they were doing other things, or if they just put it on in the morning, left it on all day, or but it was a puzzle as to why they weren't turning it off more or spending less time watching television. I mean, it may not be a huge issue, but we would have expected to see one lead to the other, and we didn't see that. So I think that's another area that be interesting to have further research. And then I think this issue around the social isolation piece, whether or not the Friends and Family app would really make a difference, and what else could be done to improve outcomes in that area across the all types of customers was important as well. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Can I go? You can go.
I can hear you anyway.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in this sort of friends and family
Yeah.
that you've talked about, and there's some quite interesting research about how people are more likely to use that kind of app if others in their social networks are also using that app.
Yeah.
So, especially if the person is not familiar with using that kind of thing in the first place, it's the fact that others in their network are using that. That's why Facebook wouldn't be successful if other people weren't using Facebook. If you were on Facebook by yourself, it would be meaningless.
Yeah.
And then I think the other point you made, I think was useful, is okay, you can have this app, but if you don't have a lot of friends and family, then who are you going to talk to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, it was quite a sensitive area, I think, because, we were sort of saying to them, can you not just turn on the Friends and Family app so we can see if it's having an impact? And they were saying, we have to move really slowly with people. And it's not because we don't want to turn this app on for them. But that can be quite a sensitive conversation with people. And have you got anyone you would like to call? And I think, that they do observe that people are quite socially isolated, and it's a difficult conversation for them to have with people as well. And it's an area, if we were doing this study again, I'd really design it differently around that to try and understand it better, because I was interested in the extent to which actually you can make new friends through the internet. You can make new friends potentially through the networks of customers. So there are other ways, and I think that the new friends piece might be more important than connecting with existing family, because I think people who have engaged and support of existing family are already in contact with them. The difference between a telephone call and a video call might not be huge. You can get to see people, it's a bit nicer. It's not the same as I have no friends and now I do have friends, and the kind of impact that might have. So, with hindsight, I would have approached that differently, because I think I don't think we expected that the needs to be as high as they were as well. But it's definitely an area that needs more research.
There's always that sort of threshold. If people have sort of a satisfactory communication network, maybe they do it, maybe they don't. What would be the thing that prompts them to try to go up that steep learning curve of using a new bit of some digital something that they're not familiar with?
Yeah, and I think, all around the kind of motivation, I think it's probably very difficult for someone who's been doing the same thing for years and years and years, and they get up, they put the TV on, they have their appointments, and that's it. It's probably very difficult to then start to,
Must be a reason why. Yeah.
Yeah.
That they would want.
Yeah.
Like that's part of the motivation.
How do you motivate somebody? And how, I think one of the things that people need to feel like there's something online for them, and we found this in our research. We've done research right across the world on digital exclusion, and it's always the case that the costs need to outweigh the benefits for people, and there's a cost in terms of upskilling yourself and trying something new and the fear of it and so on, and there needs to be something on there for you, and there isn't. That's not always the case. The internet content is so focused on young people, English speakers and so on, that there's lots of groups in the world who are excluded from that. So yeah. Someone there.
Hi. So Was the idea really with the app just to get people talking face to face with other friends and family?
Yeah.
It wasn't a sort of delayed messaging system like Facebook where you could sort of log on and see what messages you've got. And so you're really just trying to enhance remote communication.
It's just video calling. So for safeguarding issues, people couldn't just have Skype, right? So all of the apps are specifically designed for the system and are preloaded. And so the friends and family are agreed in advance. Sorry. So the friends and family are agreed in advance. Everything is preloaded and it's not an open system like Skype. But that's all it is video communication. For some customers, there were social networking opportunities as well, which is a separate issue. And the two need to be thought of separately from each other in terms of the impact that they're having. And I suppose my thinking on it towards the end of the study was that the social networking element of it, although there are risks as well for people, and that would need to be monitored and managed and so on, that potentially would have more potential. There's a lot of controversy around social media and the negative impacts of social media, and I'm personally not a fan of social media. However, I am aware there's a lot of research that for lots of groups who experience social isolation, that it has a lot of potential and it can be well-being enhancing if it's used effectively. So I think that's something that could be explored more.
Thank you. It seems to me, including in the discussions we've had about older people, there's a lot about we want more people to be able to help, but there aren't enough people to be able to help. So we're trying to find digital solutions to that. And this seems to be one of them, but it's a good study to get the ball rolling, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
It's possibly more of a comment than a question, but you may choose to respond. I mean, I did some work looking at the circumstances of older people in Wales. Admittedly, it's a little bit dated now, but we did look at social networks. And sad though it may seem, but there is a minority of older people who, well, first of all, there are some people who would not wish to have face-to-face even through video communications because they would want to make out they don't think they look at their best and all the rest of it. And so that might put them off. But the other thing is there is actually a sizable minority of people who don't want to invest the time in new social relationships because at that age you lose people and they don't want to go through the trauma of losing friends that actually engaging, if you like that, would bring with it, inevitably.
Yeah, and so our sample was quite small and we didn't have large enough sample to look at, say, over 75s compared to other groups in any meaningful way. But when we're talking about older people, it's 45 plus. So apologies. I'm kind of looking at it very soon myself. That what we did over 65s and we did 45 to 65, but when we talked about younger people, we meant under 45, and there was a small group of under 45s. So I don't know if the interest in that declined with age, but I think it was an issue across, even for younger, older people. There was a high degree of social isolation, and there wasn't a big appetite to use this app. So I don't think that it was just that. I think there's something else at play. Yes.
Did you see, or would you expect to see any further social decline in people that didn't have many social interactions before and then decide perhaps to do this sort of digital socialization? Did you see any further decline in the real socialization then?
That they were making friends like outside of like non-digital, kind of like in face-to-face, is that what you mean? Or
yeah, like if somebody was mildly engaging on a personal level and then picks up the digital engagement, would you expect a further reduction in the personal engagement?
That the digital engagement displaces the... The evidence that I'm aware of from outside of this study is that that's not the case. as I was saying, people who are good at making relationships offline are good at making them online, and it's usually that they just have a total larger number of social networks. That displacement thing, there isn't any evidence for that as I understand it. You just get more social people and people who are better at doing that kind of thing than others. And so you get a bit of a, actually rather, although there are good examples of how online social networking and so on can improve outcomes for people who are socially isolated, there is also sort of a potential exacerbation of inequalities as well, where people who are really good at making friends just have a greater number of online and offline friends, and people who are not so good at it, then the gap between those two groups widens. So the displacement thing, I don't think actually happens. And with the group that we're talking about in this piece of research, the needs are very high in this area. So I don't think that, people were, pretty desperate to have some social interaction. So I think the more, the better. But more broadly, I don't think that happens. It is interesting, yeah. But it kind of makes sense as well to some extent, because, if you're socially isolated, most people have plenty of opportunities to meet people. There are reasons why they're socially isolated. And all the internet does is it gives you another opportunity. And if you're good at grasping those opportunities, you'll be good at grasping the internet as an opportunity to do that as well.
I'm thinking, for example, if you are like a shy person,
yeah,
or a person with a huge sort of physical appearance insecurity,
yeah,
it may be easier to get friends
yeah,
on the internet, and that may prevent you to actually leave your comfort zone and move out from home.
yeah.
And find real friends. So
yeah, and actually the well-being that people get from online friendships is the same as they get from offline friendships. There isn't necessarily a distinction. This is what the research says. What I've looked at is a little out of date, because we actually did a study on this for another client a few years ago, and this is what the research found. And it's for groups, there's some very kind of startling results for groups like people with facial disfigurements, where obviously you get the anonymity of the internet, and that their well-being levels going from far below average to average from the interactions they were getting via the internet. So, as I said, for in certain circumstances and for specific groups, it can be very effective, but it's not an end in itself. If there are reasons why, shyness is something you could overcome via the internet, but not for everybody, and it might just mean that it's just another thing you struggle with, or you're not very good at. So, yeah, I think anyway, it's still very much a developing area and needs more research.
it's a very complex topic.
It is complex, yeah, because there's so many different groups with different needs, and yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think there is coffee outside.